Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Revolution 250 Advisory Group. We're a consortium of 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And my day job is I'm a history professor at Suffolk University in Boston. And today what we'll be talking about is what Benjamin Franklin is doing in the Prelude to Independence. Franklin was a great believer in the British Empire. His son was the governor of New Jersey, and one of the proudest moments for Franklin was watching the coronation of King George III. Benjamin Franklin, the son of a Boston soap boiler, was in the upper balcony at Westminster Abbey when the royal procession came in, and there on the floor he could see just a dozen or so people behind the new king, his son William, who was becoming an established courtier in London. So the Franklins clearly had made it. And then things go south for Franklin in 1773 and 1774. He is in London. And in the wake of the Boston Tea Party, Franklin is called before the Privy Council and is excoriated as the person who had brought this crisis on. So things had not gone well for Franklin. And in late 1774, he does play a few rounds of chess with Catherine Howe. And the chess matches arranged with Catherine Howe were really a pretext so that Franklin could meet with Catherine's brothers, Admiral Sir Richard Howe, General William Howe, who were going to be sent to America to try to quell this rebellion. The Howes did not want a war in America. Franklin did not want a war between Britain and America. And as Franklin recalled, they were trying to save this fragile china vase, the British Empire. That 1774 doesn't really work. Early 1775, Franklin returns to America, arrives in Philadelphia on the 5th of May, where he learns a couple of things. One, he has been named by Pennsylvania to be a delegate to the Continental Congress. Two, on April 19th, war had actually begun. So this changes things for Franklin, changes things for the American colonies, and of course changes things for the British Empire. Franklin writes a hurried letter to his friend Joseph Priestley back in London telling him about these things, and also says, there's something very interesting I wanted to share with you, but it'll have to wait. The thing he wants to share with Priestley is on his way back to America, Franklin had taken measurements, had taken the temperature of the Gulf Stream. So that's a story for another day. In May of 1775, that is shortly after his return, Franklin goes to meet with his son William, governor of New Jersey. They meet at Joseph Galloway's house. Galloway is an old ally of Franklin from the Pennsylvania Assembly, and he has an estate in Bucks County. And William and Joseph Galloway are supporters of the crown, not of Parliament. They agreed with Franklin that Parliament had overstepped, but Benjamin Franklin has now turned against the entire empire. When William says maybe what we need is a commission appointed by the crown to try to resolve disputes, he finds out that in February, a commission had been proposed by members of Parliament. Benjamin Franklin had squelched the idea, saying it was no commissioner, he said, could ever be able to make my countrymen take black for white and wrong for right. So Benjamin Franklin has turned in early 1775, and he says that Parliament's claim of sovereignty over 3 million of virtuous, sensible people in America seems the greatest of absurdities, since they, Parliament, appear to have scarce discretion enough to govern a herd of swine. So Franklin is done with the empire. People remember later that summer, Benjamin Franklin went over to New Jersey to meet with his son, the governor, and summer night, windows are open, and neighbors recall the rising voices of these two men, both smart, both stubborn, each one sure of his own side. And each one was convinced that he was right, and neither one could understand why the other one disagreed with him. So Congress, meanwhile, we'll get away from Franklin's personal problems here, the family problems, which are related to this imperial crisis. Congress, to which Franklin is a delegate, immediately put him on a committee to establish a post office. You may recall he had been the deputy postmaster. He had actually lost that position in the wake of the Boston Tea Party. And he and his son-in-law, Richard Bache, plan a new postal system centered in Philadelphia and running from Falmouth in Maine to Savannah in Georgia. And then Franklin is chosen the Postmaster General. He gets a salary of $1,000 a year, which he donates to the care of wounded soldiers. He's also put on a committee to report on a petition to the king. Back in the 1774, Congress had sent a petition to the king. They were awaiting the king's response. Lexington and Concord seemed to be the king's response. Also on the committee to manufacture saltpeter, an important ingredient in manufacturing gunpowder, as well as to arrange for the printing of paper money. And he suggests a leaf design for currency, since no two leaves have the same veins. Then on the 3rd of July, Pennsylvania chooses him to be president of their Council of Safety. He's appointed to this position by the Assembly. So every morning, remember, he's 70 years old. He's at 6 every morning till 9 every morning. He is presiding at the Pennsylvania Council of Safety. Then he leaves that to go to the meetings of Congress, which meets until 4, doing all kinds of different things, planning currency, planning a post office, petitions, etc. He also proposes a pike for defense. He presents a model of a pike that can be used in defense. He also recommends bows and arrows. The pikes will be used against bayonets, which are the British favorite weapon of choice. He knows the difficulty of getting lead and gunpowder, and in fact, he's put on a committee to find lead and iron ore throughout the country. And he's also on a committee to build armed boats, rowing gondolas, that is preparing for defense, knowing a war has begun. War is going to come not only to Massachusetts and New York, but ultimately to Philadelphia. In July, he presents to Congress his plan of union that he had devised back at the Albany Conference in 1754, remembering that once upon a time he had proposed having the colonies unite, and now seems like the essential moment to do this. Congress, by the way, does allow Franklin to land the cargo of books and other things that he has brought over from England. He had left France, stopped in England. He had left England, and he had a lot of books and things. He'd been living there for about a dozen years. And so he has a lot of things, but Congress had put a boycott on British goods, an embargo on British goods, but they allow Franklin to land these things. And on the Committee of Safety, as a way of for defense, Franklin proposes that Quakers and Moravians, two religious denominations that don't believe in war, that is, they're pacifists, that they should be excused from military service. There's actually a push to disqualify them from any civil office because they won't bear arms. But Franklin sees the legitimacy of someone having legitimate claims against going to war. They should be excused from military service, but should have to pay something toward the cost of defense. In October, Congress sends Franklin with a delegation to Cambridge to meet with Washington to confer about proper measures of defense. He writes to Priestley about this as he's on his way to Cambridge to meet with Washington, reporting that in this previous campaign, at the expense of £3 million, the British have killed 150 Yankees, which he says is 20,000 pounds a head. At Bunker's Hill, Franklin reports, she gained a mile of ground, half of which she lost again by taking our post at Plowed Hill. During the same time, when the British have killed 150 Americans, 60,000 children have been born in America. From these data, he says, Priestley and his mathematical friends can calculate the time and expense necessary to kill us all and conquer our whole territory. So Franklin goes to Cambridge to meet with Washington to consult on matters of defense. One of the most striking moments in this meeting with Washington is at the dinner, attended by, among others, Abigail Adams. And Abigail just gushes in a letter to her husband, John, seeing Dr. Franklin. From my infancy, she said, I had been taught to venerate Franklin's character. And in his countenance, she saw patriotism shown in its full luster. And with that is blended every virtue of a Christian. For a true patriot must be a religious man. Abigail would become disabused of her notions of Franklin during the time she shares with Franklin in Paris. But nonetheless, here she sees him as really a symbol. Now, on his way back to Philadelphia, Franklin stops in Warwick, Rhode Island, where his sister Jane Meekum is staying. Jane, Franklin's younger sister, during the course of his life, she is the person with whom Franklin corresponds the most. And she idolizes her older brother, who is the most celebrated man in the world. And Jane had been staying in Rhode Island during the occupation of Boston. She lives in a house in Boston that Franklin owns, just behind the Old North Church. And she is staying there with Catherine Ray Green, who is a teenager, had met Franklin on one of his trips to New England. And Franklin takes Jane, as well as Catherine's son, who is 10 years old, back to Philadelphia with him. And on their way back to Philadelphia, they meet again in New Jersey with William Franklin, who is the governor. This is at Perth Amboy in New Jersey. Previously, Franklin had met with him in Burlington. New Jersey had two governors, two capitals, in Perth Amboy in the east and in Burlington in the west. And Jane is really in awe. She idolizes her older brother, and she absolutely adores her nephew. And she sees his position as governor of New Jersey as being such a wonderful thing. She doesn't really get the sense of this estrangement growing between father and son, between her brother and her nephew, an estrangement which will, of course, turn quite bitter in the coming years. Nonetheless, back in Philadelphia, Franklin, as I said, has been put on various committees, and then he is put on a secret committee of correspondence by Congress. Congress realizes, knows a lot more people than anyone else in Congress. And so he's on a secret committee of correspondence, along with John Jay and John Dickinson and Benjamin Harrison of Virginia and Thomas Johnson of Maryland, though most of the work on this committee falls to Franklin because he knows more people. And his job really is to write to people in Europe to try to get Europeans on the side of the Americans. In some ways, this committee of secret correspondence is the first real committee of foreign affairs set up by this nascent United States or United Colonies. It's still not clear what the outcome of all of this will be. Will it be reconciliation with the crown? Will it be independence? If it is independence, what will that look like? So this is really a very tentative, very important first step. So Franklin begins writing to people he knows in England, Ireland, France, other parts of the world. Most of his correspondence had been through natural philosophy or science. So this is kind of a new idea of bringing a political alliance from this scientific correspondence Franklin had been having. So that's how Franklin is spending most of 1775. In 1776, of course, things do change a bit. And one of the things that had happened at the end of 1775 was Congress had decided it was time to bring Canada into this union. So they had dispatched an army to Canada, which had taken Montreal, and Benedict Arnold had gone up through Maine to join up with this army. And in December of 1775, the American army had besieged the British forces in Quebec and failed to take Quebec. Back in the 1760-61, when the British and the French were contesting over Quebec, you may know that General Wolfe besieges Quebec, and General Montcalm comes out to fight him. All he needed to do was stay in the fort, and Wolfe probably would not have been able to take Quebec. The British learned from this, and General Carleton, who is the Governor General of Canada, stays in the fortress. And on the last day of the year of 1776, General Montgomery, the American commander, is killed in the siege of Quebec. Benedict Arnold is wounded, and the Americans have withdrawn from Quebec, but are still hoping to hold on to Canada. The idea was the Canadians would rise up in support and join us in opposing the British crown. But it turns out the Canadians were kind of happy with the British crown. Now, Franklin and a number of commissioners are sent to Canada to kind of help things out in a diplomatic way. Franklin goes along, and again, Franklin, someone who is well known in France, an able diplomat. You really can't send a better person, but granted, Franklin is now 70 years old, and his health is not good. He has kidney stones. He's suffering from gout and the other ailments that happen when you're a 70-year-old, not in very good physical shape. The others sent are Charles Carroll, who is a Catholic priest, recognizing that the French Canadians are Catholic. And also for about 100 years, the French in Canada and the New Englanders had been fighting a war. And the New Englanders are virulent Protestants. So sending a Catholic priest, along with his brother, John Carroll is the priest, Charles Carroll of Carrollton is a member of Congress, along with Samuel Chase of Maryland. The Carroll brothers, not only are they Catholic, they were both educated in France. So this delegation goes up to Montreal. It doesn't go quickly to Montreal. They spend 2 days in New York. And New York now, this is in the early 1776, is anticipating a British invasion. In fact, Governor Tryon has taken refuge on a warship in New York Harbor. New York is in a state of disquiet as the British are besieged in Boston. New York is still not entirely patriot, not entirely loyal. Governor Tryon has taken refuge on a warship in the harbor. Franklin meets with a friend of his, a Mrs. Barrow, and her husband has joined Tryon on his warship in New York Harbor. And Mrs. Barrow is quite angry with her husband. And all that time, she says, that naughty man had not once ventured on shore to see her. She is at home, staying at the house, but she worries if the Continental troops arrive, which they very likely will once the siege of Boston ends, she's afraid they'll use her house as a barracks. So Franklin goes to talk to the general officers who are in charge of the American forces and gets them to agree not to take Mrs. Barrow's house. She's a friend of Franklin's, even though her husband is a loyalist. Let her keep her house. Don't molest her. I'm sorry, I don't know what happens to Mrs. Barrow and her house after this, as Franklin, the Carrolls, and Samuel Chase then get on a sloop and sail up to Albany. And it takes them a couple of days to get up the Hudson River. Remember, this is March. And in early April, they're still en route. And they get to Albany finally in the second week or so of April. They stay at the home of Philip Schuyler, about a mile out of Albany. And there, Franklin notes his lively, agreeable, black-eyed girls, Betsy and Peggy. He spends 2 days with Schuyler in Albany. He notes, he had been in Albany back in 1754. He notes that English is spoken more in Albany now than Dutch. Dutch was still the prominent language in Albany, but English was overtaking it. Then they go up to Saratoga to stay at Philip Schuyler's country estate. This is April, and there's 6 inches of snow on the ground. There's so much ice on Lake George that they can't really navigate it. They make their way finally up to Fort George and find out that the lake isn't open. And they do finally get onto flatboats, making their way across this lake through this broken ice, spending their night on shore, building fires to warm themselves. Miserable, miserable trip. April 25th, they reach Lake Champlain, and then on the 27th, they reach St. John's, and their French calèches, French sleds, meet to take them up to the St. Lawrence River. Finally, on the 29th of April, they've been now on the road for over a month, they reach Montreal, where they're greeted by General Benedict Arnold. The next day, they have their first conference with Arnold and with others, and they learn that the situation is really dire. That is, these American forces had been repulsed from Quebec, but are still hoping to besiege it again and take it in the spring. There are 400 or so English Protestants in Canada, and of those, about half want to remain loyal to the British Crown. The French Catholics are absolutely hostile to the Americans. Guy Carleton, the Governor General of Canada, has been a much better administrator than any of the other royal governors in the American colonies. One wonders what would have happened if Carleton, rather than Hutchinson, had been governor of Massachusetts, or Carleton, rather than Tryon, had been governor of New York. Things, of course, might have turned out differently. So things are really dire just from the basis of the Canadians not really eager, not eager to join. They're hostile to the whole idea of joining with these other American colonies. And also, the Americans have no money. So Franklin has to loan them about 350 pounds because the American forces are broke. The whole thing, Franklin realizes, is a disaster. And then they get news on the 6th of May that British reinforcements have now landed at Quebec. That is, the St. Lawrence River had opened, the British send reinforcements to Quebec. So now instead of being besieged in Quebec, Carleton has a bigger force that's going to come up the river to Montreal and retake it from the Americans. So Franklin and John Carroll decide to leave. Franklin advises Carroll, maybe you should go on ahead. That is, as a younger man will travel faster. But Carroll, who's a much younger man, stays with Franklin, taking care of this old man on the road back, on this very difficult road back. They find it difficult even to get a wagon to take them out because the Canadians don't want the Americans to know they have any wagons or any conveyances. They're afraid they'll take them. And the Canadians aren't going to provide the American troops with anything else. Franklin writes to Philip Schuyler that the army must starve, plunder, or surrender. You know, his advice is for the army to clear out. Congress still wants the army to take Canada. Carroll and Franklin also are accompanied by an American couple, Thomas Walker and his wife. They had been living in Montreal, and they were the hosts of Franklin and Carroll during their time there. And the Walkers had been friendly to the Americans. Remember, the Americans had occupied Montreal for a while. And as I said, when Franklin arrives, they find most of the Canadians really hostile to the Americans. And the Walkers were among the few who were supportive of them, telling their friends, this will be great, having the Americans running things. But the Americans had done nothing to win over the support of anyone else. Now, the Walkers fear, once all the Americans leave, our neighbors will attack us. So they also say, it's really your fault, you inept Americans that got us into this situation. Everything was fine until you showed up. Franklin says it almost came to a quarrel. They did give the Walkers 3 wagons for all of their stuff and then bring them back to Albany at the expense of Franklin. And at Albany, he says, we parted civilly, though coldly. And Mrs. Walker continued to abuse the Americans for having caused this problem. And Franklin says, I think that both of them, the Walkers, have an excellent talent at making themselves enemies. I believe, live where they will never be long without them. He was very philosophical about people like the Walkers. Now, Carroll accompanies Franklin, as I said, back to the American side of things. And later on, this will be important because in 1781, when Franklin is the American minister to France, or American commissioner to France, the papal nuncio will call on him. And the papal nuncio tells him that the Pope wants to create an American bishop. And he thinks he'll have to send someone from France. Knowing that the French and the Americans now are allied in this cause, maybe having a French bishop go to America would be the thing to do. And Franklin says, no, I have someone in mind as the American bishop, John Carroll. He's a priest. And the papal nuncio says, but he would have to come back to France to become ordained. And Franklin says, no, he can just go up to Montreal. And the papal nuncio is a little puzzled by this, knowing that Montreal is now in enemy territory, and wouldn't the Americans not want someone coming by way of Montreal? And Franklin says, that doesn't matter. John Carroll is the man. Send him to Montreal to be consecrated a bishop. And that is what happens in 1783, when John Carroll becomes the first American bishop, really on the recommendation of Benjamin Franklin. And as you may know, Carroll also is the founder of Georgetown, a college established in Washington. So Franklin had left behind Canada and comes back to Philadelphia, gets there in time to be put on the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. And most of the real work on that, as we know, is done by Thomas Jefferson. There was some fear that if Franklin wrote it, he was such a man of words that he might put some puns or other subtle jokes in it that the most of us wouldn't get, but those who did. So Franklin is not on the committee, but does make some very good contributions stylistically to it. Jefferson does most of the writing, and then Jefferson is in agony when the Declaration is being discussed by Congress and edited by this committee of Congress. And Franklin tells him the story about John Smith, who opens a hat store, and he has a sign with a picture of a hat, and underneath there's a John Smith at this address proposes to make hats and sell them for ready money. And one by one, friends come into him and say, well, do you really need to say sell them for ready money? Because no one's going to sell a hat on credit. So he takes that out. John Smith makes and sells hats. Someone says, well, I want to buy a hat. I don't want to know where it was made. I just want to know where I can buy it. So it becomes John Smith sells hats. He also says at this address. Someone says, why are you going to put up a sign when it's not where you're selling them? So that comes out. So now it says John Smith sells hats. Someone else looks at it and says, sells hats. Wouldn't expect you to give hats away. So it just says John Smith hats until someone points out you have a picture of a hat. Then you have the word hats. That's redundant. So Franklin knew how to make words work. There, by the way, there's another anecdote. As the delegates were signing the Declaration of Independence in August, that Franklin is purported to have said, we must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. It is a great line. It doesn't appear in any of the contemporary sources. The first time it appears in print is in Jared Sparks' 10-volume Works of Franklin, published in 1840. And Sparks, I have to say, is not the most reliable editor. It is a great line. Franklin could have said it. Did he actually say it? Well, we'll leave that for another day. Now, as Congress is debating how to create this new entity, now that we are declaring our independence, again, he had brought forward his plan of union from 1754. He also favors having each state vote in Congress according to population, not according to each state being a state. You know, up to this point in Congress, each state had one vote. Franklin thinks that this really wouldn't be a good thing, since smaller states would have more representation, perhaps, than they deserved. And he said, I hear many ingenious arguments to persuade us that unequal representation is a very good thing. If we had been born and bred under an unequal representation, we might bear it. But to set out with unequal representation is a bad thing. It is said that the great colonies will swallow up the less. Scotland said the same thing at the Union. That was back in 1707. At the time of the Union of England and Scotland, the Duke of Argyll was most violently opposed to that measure, and among other things predicted that as the whale had swallowed Jonah, so England would swallow Scotland. However, when Lord Bute came into the government, he brought into his administration so many of his countrymen that it was found, in any event, that Jonah had swallowed the whale. Franklin loses this round, but later the Constitution does give each state representation according to population in the House of Representatives. Now, while this is going on in Congress, up in New York, the British had arrived. They had defeated the Americans at Long Island and were about to destroy Washington's army, which was stuck between Manhattan and Long Island. And at this juncture, the British had captured General John Sullivan, and Sullivan had been sent to Congress with an offer from Admiral Howe, that Howe could do all kinds of things to alleviate the crisis, and Howe wanted to talk to influential people. John Adams says, no, under no circumstances should we send anyone to negotiate with Admiral Howe, because he can't set aside acts of Parliament. And Adams also said, I wish the first bullet the British had fired at Long Island had gone through Johnny Sullivan's head. And Congress does decide they should send someone, and they send Adams because he's the most against doing anything. They also send Benjamin Franklin, and they send, I believe, Henry Lawrence to go to meet with Lord Howe. Or Edward Rutledge, I'm sorry, another Carolinian goes on this meeting. And Franklin and Howe, as I said, had met a year or so earlier at Catherine Howe's home. And these three Americans make their way across New Jersey, and all along the route, what they see are American troops who were deserting from the army around New York. They see this cause as lost. Why are we going to hang on to let this overwhelming British force defeat us? As Washington was having the Declaration of Independence read to his troops on the Battery on Manhattan on July the 9th, they could see this huge British force arriving at Staten Island, where Admiral Howe had his headquarters in a stone house on Long Island. And Adams writes about the thoughtless dissipation of the American officers and soldiers they see straggling and loitering. They reach the shore in New Jersey, and Admiral Howe has sent a boat for them with a British officer, and the British officer is going to stay on the New Jersey shore as kind of a hostage in case Howe tries to kidnap Franklin, Rutledge, and Adams. The Americans will have this hostage to guarantee their safe return. Adams, Franklin, and Rutledge think it's kind of silly not to trust Admiral Howe, who's negotiating in good faith, so they insist this British officer come with them. And when the delegation of Americans arrives at Howe's headquarters with this British officer, Howe's face brightens. He looks at this officer, turns to the Americans, and says that you gentlemen have paid me a great compliment. And he tells the Americans that their trust is the most sacred thing. And then they have a very nice dinner of claret, bread, cold ham, tongues, and mutton. Howe had prepared. He had branches spread on the ground. And this turns out to be really the high point of the meeting. Howe's face brightening at the sign of his hostage, and then the good lunch. But then Howe says, I can only treat with you gentlemen as influential citizens, not as a committee of Congress, because neither Howe nor the British government can recognize that Congress exists. And this begins an argument, because of course Adams says, well, we are only here as a delegation from Congress. And Howe says, yes, but I cannot consider you as a delegation from Congress. I can only consider you as three influential Americans. And Adams says, but we would not be here if we were not from Congress. And Howe says, yes, but I cannot receive you as members of Congress. And then Adams says, your lordship may consider me in whatever light you please. And indeed, I'll be willing to consider myself in any character which would be agreeable to your lordship, except that of a British subject. Howe turns to Franklin and says, Mr. Adams is a decided character. And they reply, we've come to listen. Adams doesn't know that his name is on the list of people who will not be pardoned, no matter what else Howe can do. Howe outlines his proposal. If the Americans resume their allegiance to the king, he'll pardon them. The king will pardon them for rebelling, except, as I said, for John Adams and a few others. Howe doesn't mention that. Rutledge speaks up and says, we've had 2 years of anarchy. The states have created new governments. It's really too late now for reconciliation. This really surprises Howe. And he speaks very emotionally of how much deeply he feels for America. Massachusetts, which is where the rebellion really began, has a special place in Howe's heart. His brother George had led Massachusetts troops at Fort Ticonderoga on the Lake Champlain during the 7 Years' War, and in fact had died there. And Massachusetts had put up a monument to George Howe in Westminster Abbey. He feels a special affection for Americans, and particularly for Massachusetts. And he says, if America should fall, I would feel as though I've lost another brother. And Franklin says, we will do our utmost endeavors to save your lordship that mortification. And with this, the conference ends. Franklin, Adams, and Rutledge make their way back to Philadelphia, and Howe and the British forces drive Washington out of New York. And Washington and his army are being driven across New Jersey when Franklin, in the end of October, with his two grandsons, William Temple Franklin, the son of his son William, and Benjamin Franklin Bache, the son of his daughter Sarah, board the ship Reprisal to head for France. Franklin had learned that France was not ready to recognize American independence, but it was shipping 200,000 pounds worth of arms to the West Indies through a secret agreement between Pierre Beaumarchais, a French playwright, had set up a dummy corporation to ship stuff to the Americans. Franklin and Robert Morris, a Philadelphia financier, keep this information from Congress. That is, they don't want everyone to know that France is secretly sending us stuff because, of course, that would require the British and the French to go to war if France is aiding this rebellion. So Franklin is going off to get more aid from France and ultimately to bring France into an alliance with the Americans. But that is a difficult proposition. Meanwhile, he turns over the post office to his son-in-law, Richard Bache, and he loans something like 3,000 to 4,000 pounds to Congress. Now, Franklin had become not independently wealthy, but well off enough that he had a disposable income, and he loans 4,000 pounds to Congress in the hope this will encourage others to do so. He also leaves a trunk filled with papers and all of his correspondence at the home of Joseph Galloway. Galloway was remaining loyal to the crown and would remain loyal to the crown, but Franklin reasons that this trunk full of papers would be safer at Galloway's house, Galloway being a loyalist, than at Franklin's house. And on the reprisal, Franklin and his two grandsons sail across the North Atlantic in the end of October and into November. He's exhausted. His eyesight is failing. He's afflicted with boils, with the gout, venturing off to try to secure an alliance in Europe against the British, something that seems impossible to do. So that's what Franklin was up to in 1776. Perhaps at another point, we'll have an opportunity to talk more about Franklin and his role in the creation of the American Republic. But for now, I want to thank you for joining us and thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, as well as regular listeners in places like Vestal, New York, and Amsterdam, New York, here in Massachusetts, and Beverly and Chicopee, in Independence, Missouri, Centennial, Colorado, Newark, New Jersey, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Dublin, Indiana, Dublin, Ohio, all places between and beyond. If you want to send Jonathan Lane an email, send jlane@revolution250.org. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.